Okay, so by the way, so it's definitely something with StreamYard because as we are getting ready to go live, it was doing a weird thing with their live thing. I don't know what that was going on with it, but it went live. It took forever to go live. But anyway, it's a great another episode of Conlon's Corner. We're excited to talk of multitude of different things as we always do, and we cover many different topics. Um, we were briefly talking a little bit of election material beforehand. Obviously, there's a lot going on there, as most people probably know if they've listened to anything I do. I'm pretty conservative as far as politically, and but by the way, I'm still a friendly guy.
Yeah, it's funny. I've for the last like 3.5 years, I've been the treasurer of the city of Derby. So I was an elected official. I recently had to just resign because I moved out of Derby, which has been kind of weird because I've lived in the valley like my whole life. I find myself to be very moderate. I'm very in between. There's a lot of topics from one side that I agree with, and there's a couple from the other. So I always love, I'm very like, I don't lean too far right and I don't lean too far left either. So I feel like I'm like a perfect blend. I've usually always been independent, but I had to be a registered Democrat to run um, in the city of Derby to be treasurer. So don't throw eggs through the computer at me. I'm actually very, very moderate, very moderate.
Yeah, well, local elections. People don't realize that local elections usually whatever political party you're in, it doesn't really necessarily have anything to do with what your national or federal, or even statewide, your political affiliation would be outside, because local elections has a lot to do with what will get you elected in that town, that which is very different than what might be like a national thing. People don't realize that though. People always think that like, oh, they ran as this. I've met many people that were like ran Democrat locally, but they were actually Republicans, and it's interesting. But yeah, local politics and federal politics are two different things. But you're
Well,
yeah,
what people don't realize is like the local elections are, I'm not saying that like the national elections aren't important. Obviously they are from a much different perspective, but your local and your state elections are so much more important to what's really truly going to affect you because as we know, right? Like every state operates differently. And so, your governors and your local officials are tremendously important to how you're impacted in your own state. So I feel like there's always so much hoorah around the national elections and not enough hoorah around the state and local elections because whatever's happening federally, you're still being controlled by your state and your governing policies there, which could be very different than California, Texas, Florida, and some of these other places. So I wish more people would get out for the local elections and understand that like that's really what affects you and affects
yep.
like your bottom line. Like people get so crazy about the national elections and I'm like, yeah, they're important, right? Like well, every election's important, but get out there and vote locally and vote for your state stuff because that's what's really going to affect you.
Well, that's 100% true. Like, it's one of the things. Like when you pick the town you're living in, you actually want to know politically what's going on before you pick that town. Some people don't even look at that. It's crazy to me. But
Yep.
you want to pick it. Now, a city's different. Like a big city, like New York City, kind of know what the politics are. Um, but like towns that you go to, you want to know what this town kind of is like as far as politically, and hopefully that aligns with what you're thinking, because that's kind of how it's going to be your whole entire life there. Very rarely is that going to change too much.
Yep.
Um, and then obviously state wise, I always tell people that the state you live in, and what their dynamics are politically, like you're 100% right. That affects your pocketbook. That affects what the state's makeup is. Affects what the state's educational components are, and multitude of other things. And like that's really the biggest thing that affects you. So if you live in like Connecticut, like you do, or I live in New Jersey, like you have to know that living in New Jersey, and I'm sure Connecticut's similar. Living in Connecticut, the politics are primarily going to be more to the left, and you have to know that. Like for me, I'm conservative. That you're in an uphill battle if you choose to live in that state. That's kind of the dynamics of the state. So it's now there are pros to it, obviously. I mean, educationally in New Jersey and Connecticut, it's like if you go to high school, those states, um, they're much better than the national average, probably among the best in the country. So there's pros and cons, but it's important to know those things. I think sometimes people don't like really. You're right because the national thing is, first of all, it's fun to post on social media. It's interesting. It gets a lot more views. It's more exciting. Um, unless you have migrants running to your town, you probably don't have a lot that's going to change within your local community,
Yep.
unless someone gets into power locally that is not in line with what you're looking for.
Yeah. So how do you feel? I know you follow the election really closely and everything that's going on. What's your perspective on the landscape right now and what's happening out there? I listened to an interesting pod yesterday that I didn't know was going to like go into politics, but it did at the end, and it was a little bit eye opening just from a different perspective because it's not necessarily someone that I would have thought would have given me like a little tidbit, but I actually left the pod feeling a little bit more educated, which was cool. So, what's your perspective?
So there's a few things that are like important, like to me personally. So kind of quick background, like I grew up Democrat family. Um, like my whole family were Democrats. Um, my father was a lifelong Democrat. His parents were, my mother's an immigrant, um, so they were lifelong Democrats. But everybody shifted basically in the 2000s as things started to change differently. So, like, I like to say that like I didn't really change my values too much. I feel like the Democrat Party changed their values and what was important to them. So people might say when I say my values that I change, I don't know. But the way that I look at it is that they change dramatically. Like I think of the Democrat Party more of like the party of John F. Kennedy, of like true liberalism, trying to give people an opportunity to succeed, trying to uh, get to fight for equality. I feel like the Democratic Party now is very concerned with equity, which is different than equality. So that to me is a little bit different shift. I think that um, they're much more concerned with a lot of identity politics stuff. To me, I think that America's evolved a ton from the time of Jim Crow to civil rights to a lot affirmative action, where that there's much greater opportunity in America, and that I'm a big believer in that people should be rewarded based on merit. And now, if you were to say, "Hey, would I have felt like that in 1990?" I would have said, "Yeah, maybe my viewpoint would have been different in 1990 on that, because I think America was going to a different place." So, like when I was going to college, graduating high school, I graduated in '92. When I went to UConn initially, like I thought the world had really radically moved in a great direction at that point. I would say like the '90s and the early 2000s was like a sweet spot in the world, like where um, the world had evolved to really become a lot fairer, a lot more opportunity, and everybody looked at each other from that standpoint. And then in the last 10 to 15 years, it shifted in a completely different direction, in my opinion. Right. So I look at it like people should be, have the opportunity now based off of merit. And if it's the best person, they should have the opportunity. I look at from a financial, because I'm an entrepreneur, that I think that, small business, I think big government, um, uh, the Democrat Party helps big government, has bigger government, which helps bigger corporations to become monoliths and gigantic companies and squeezes out small business owners. And I think that Republicans do a better job with that in general. I'm not saying everybody does, but the opportunities and policies of the Republicans are better as a whole for small business owners because people talk about things like I'll go to get a loan at an SBA. I always tell people, go ahead, go try to get a loan at SBA, see what happens. If you're starting a business, you're going to get turned down. Okay. So you have to be able to have the opportunity and have taxes that are lower, have the opportunity to keep more of your income. So those are bigger things that are important to me. Um, as far as like foreign affairs, I do believe I'm a little more nationalistic other than certain things. So I think there are certain like have to fight back type of things. I'm big that I think I'm a big supporter of Israel. I think that it's one of it is the only democracy in the Middle East, and I'm a born again Christian, so I'm a big believer that it's an important part of our own success in the United States to have a presence there. People that are on the left disagree obviously with me, but I believe that's an important part, not just biblically, but also from a Democrat standpoint. And there's not that many bastions of freedom anymore around the United States, around the world, and I think that that's one of them. And I think that's an important part. Some of the other wars and some of the other things, like do I think Russia is potentially dangerous? Yeah, I do. Do I think that uh, we have to fight against it for try to help Ukraine in the best way we can? I think yeah, we do, with kind of a caveat that we have to try to find a solution. Like we can't just fight wars to fight wars. And even the same thing with me, even with Israel, is like I feel like they have to let Israel do what they need to do, succeed, so we can get to a resolution. But if you do these kind of half support things, then you get into these situations where these things drag on and you have to try to figure out who wants to get things done and who doesn't, and get those. So that's kind of a little bit what we're saying. The abortion issue is always a hot topic. I always feel like women in general, I'm generalizing, but women in general are going to lean for the most part much more to abortion, having more liberal viewpoint as to what you can do there than necessarily my viewpoint. And I would say my viewpoint comes from somewhat also personal. Like when I was, growing up, I a girl that I was dating had an abortion. Okay, and it was one of the things that I was kind of against at the time, but it didn't affect my life. I always felt it's one of the things to me that feels empty in my life. So even though I have a son, I'm grateful to have a son, but that's one of those things that I felt like I went. Now I also understand people with incest and rape, and those are situations, you know, um, potential death of the mother. Um, those are very sticky situations that I really think um, you kind of have to lean to the side of the female to be able to understand the exact situation. So that's where I do admit there's a sticky point where it's not 100% perfect. You know what I mean? So, and that's where the whole um, gray area of all of it really becomes, and that's where you start to get into a lot of the abortion battles um, that really become where people start to entrench themselves, and people get really angry. Like if I talk with my sister about it, she'll get really mad at me, on some of these things, and um, you know, that's where it starts to become, my personal. And I'm saying it's my opinion because I'm not a perfect person. So, like I said, my opinion is that if two people consensually have relations and something comes out of that and they didn't adequately protect themselves in that situation, to me that is some form of that abortion should not be utilized in those situations. Now, a rape, like I said, rape, incest, extreme situations which happen with death and those kind of things, I think you got to talk about that a lot more. I don't think I have the answer on that. You know what I mean? I don't think I do. But I think to me, some of the clear cut answers is, hey, you know, we want to go and have fun, and we don't want to do things to protect ourselves, and then I think there should bear some level of responsibility. And I also understand at the same point that there becomes a responsibility on society too because of that, because there that family may not be in the best situation because of it. So I get it all. I think I understand it all. That's my viewpoint. Um, I don't think people have to be angry about it because I think people have viewpoints. The issue that people get mad at me back is that I think that going to the states is good. Um, I think that going back to the local politics thing is that when you choose a state to live in, for the most part, if you're choosing a state to live in, you're choosing a state that has certain politics, and you should understand that. Now, I live in New Jersey, you live in Connecticut. Abortion is always going to be legal in those states. It's just a matter of what term level it is. You know what I mean? Like how far it's carried or not. It's and then if you go, if you're having the states' rights thing, if you're in a state like Texas, which is where people probably would come at me, well, that's a huge state, and abortion is probably going to have a high chance of not being legal in a state like Texas. What do you do there? I appreciate debate on it, and I could say that I like to listen to it. And when we have our podcast, Rebel Republic, um, Frank, who's a conservative like I am, thinks completely different. He thinks it should be federally mandated abortion, even though almost every other topic, he's conservative. But for him, and then we would debate those things back and forth. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I think it's politics to me has become such a angry topic with so many different people because what I hate to see is like you don't agree on one thing or you support one candidate over the other and you're automatically cast as a villain depending on where you stand on specific topics. And
Right.
I think that I wish that there could be some common ground. I don't get too much into the abortion topics personally. Being a woman and I was raised Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in a same-sex marriage, so
Right.
I'm already kind of cast away from that standpoint. Although Catholicism has come a long way, even with that, and their different beliefs, and the Pope has come out with different things. So I think it's really hard to talk about stuff that doesn't necessarily affect you personally, right? Like, who am I to say what situation affects another woman in
Right.
whatever way? So I think that one's really hard. So I try to stay away from that one because, don't
It's
walk
a
a
tough,
day in some
tough topic.
don't walk a day in someone else's shoes. And I think that a lot of those topics, the people that are very one side or the other are looking at it from a religious view and not necessarily like a common sense in the moment specific situation view like you just stated. Being the mom of a daughter, I mean, God, I hope I never have to have that conversation of something happens to her that wasn't intended and
Right.
now we got to deal with that. I don't know what I would do as a parent, and I think that until you're kind of in that situation, it's easy to say, here's what I would tell my daughter to do. But put in that situation, who really knows? I mean, it's a really tough question to answer. I think so. The pod I listened to yesterday was actually Sue Bird's pod called A Touch More. And the first half of the pod was like, all sports where they were talking about WNBA stuff. And then they had Stacey Abrams on at the end, who obviously is in politics down in Georgia. Really, really intelligent, really, really well spoken. I actually liked listening to it because I think conservatives and even sometimes moderates paint these people to be villains, just like on the other side, we paint people to be villains and that they have no common sense. And she spoke a lot in terms of, the acronym DEI, and it stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Mhm.
right? And how in our society, a lot of different topics are kind of commonly woven through. And I do think from a conservative and a Democrat, because I don't think everybody on that side does a good job of making sure that they all are, consistent with that, is if you're going to say that we want everything to be diverse, that we want everybody to have equities, right? So the ability to participate and then the inclusion of being able to participate, it's got to kind of be consistent through all things. And I feel like what we're seeing throughout politics right now is that it's not consistent. We're kind of picking and choosing when we want things to be diverse, equitable, and
True.
inclusive.
True.
And they spoke a little bit about, transgender youth and sports and things like that. And it's like, well, we want people to be able, we want diversity, right? And we want everyone to be able to have equity, but we don't necessarily want to include specific groups of people. And I've gotten into conversations with people about how I feel about transgenders participating in sports and things of that nature. And I see both sides of it again, right? Like, do I think in certain scenarios that would actually be equitable and fair? Probably not, right? Like, I'm trying to think about a transgender college student competing in women's sports, right?
Right.
That are just genetically have more of an advantage than someone
Yes.
who's genetically born another way, right? So I have that now. But do I think that they should still be able to participate in sports? Yes. I don't really,
Yes.
again, it's another thing that I don't really know the answer to, because do we just come up with another class, right?
Well,
Like,
that's one of so transgender sport. I mean, like I have kind of like a firm thought process on it, um, which is I think most people, to me, agree with that. No matter what their politics are, most people think that should transgender people be able to play sports? Yes. Okay. Should a transgender, and it's really man that becomes a woman, right? Like if a woman becomes a man and participates in sports, they don't have the hormonal advantages that a man going to a female sport. So my thing is, if you can't even in transgender really even put all one category, because the truth to me is a man who becomes a woman still was born a man and has the advantages still of let's take away the hormone side, because I know they're taking hormones to change the body. Bone density, right? Like, you know, I played football at 6'1", 235 pounds. Okay. If I went took hormones to bring myself down to 200 and I don't know 15 pounds, but I would still be thick like a guy that was 235 pounds physically. At 235 pounds as a man, I had abs. I had abs. Okay, very rarely would you see a woman of that same size be built in the same way, right? Because it's just that men are different. So if they go and become a woman, the issue to me is, and you can tell me your thoughts. My always thoughts is Title IX. One of the biggest things about Title IX was giving women the opportunity to play sports. Okay, equal opportunity to men to play sports. So, for example, you go to University of Connecticut, and we have 100 football players on scholarship. And if there was no Title IX, you wouldn't have a mirroring of those number of scholarships on the females. You would just have 100 less scholarships because there is no female quote unquote football right now, right? So that's what Title IX is great about. So to me, it's giving women the opportunity. Now, if men go and play female sports because they decide to become transgender and become women, and I get it, whatever's going on with them, they feel that way. I'm not telling anyone how to feel. They could be whatever they want. I don't care what someone is. It's just like same thing with me with marriage. Always say this: if someone wants to go get married to someone of the same sex, it'd be equally as miserable as we are in the same as the opposite sex. So be it. Go have fun. No, I'm kidding. But that's to me that that's not my job to tell someone who they want to love, who they want to marry, right? Um, so same thing with someone that wants to change there. But when it comes to competition, then to me that becomes an issue because there's a potential advantage, um, and I think that becomes look swimming. The advantage is they're going to win. If they were a good male swimmer and now they become a female swimmer, they're an elite. They're going to win. Where it becomes an issue is you play basketball, you play maybe I don't know rugby, you go and play physical sports. So now it's not even just athleticism; it's actual physicality where someone else could be injured. Okay. And volleyball was the example that was used a lot recently because you see these clips of someone spiking and it's like, they pointing that as examples. Well, that's kind of a small example to me, but it's when you start to get the physical, like what obviously you play basketball, right? You're getting back down, you're a guard, you're getting back down by a 6'4" guard that was once a man, that's now a woman. Decent player as a man, now becomes an elite player as a woman, 6'4", 200-pound male, former male guard. That's going to be a physical issue, right? It's one thing to lose a 100-meter dash. It's one thing to lose in swimming, which is not good to me. But it's another thing to then get beat up. Boxing, UFC, right? Those things we've seen have clearly been difficult situations where there's a lot of arguments on what are we doing here. So I do think they should be able to play sports. Your question is very valid. What category do they go into? Because there probably isn't enough competitors yet within the transgender space. I don't know what it'll be like in 20 years, but right now there isn't as much. And that becomes the $50 million question. My one answer, which is not a perfect answer, because there's actually still many more of these people. But if you look at people that are handicapped, okay, and you have the Paralympics, and what they've tried to do, because in the Olympics, Paralympics, or even locally in some of those Special Olympic events, you may not have a ton of competitors in one event, but they are all competing still. And what they've done is um, they may run the race together, but the person who is um, doesn't have one limb, they're the winner in that category. Person who is blind is the winner in that category, and they have competition within them, and then categories, subcategories that allow them to win their category, um, break Olympic records in those categories. I think that's eventually where it's going to go wants to become enough athletes in transgender, but um, but I get it. It's difficult. It's I think when they started wheelchair basketball, right? When they probably initially started wheelchair basketball, they probably did not have a lot of competitors, is my guess. And now it's an Olympic sport all over the world, a Paralympic sport all over the world. You have people that specifically have teams in wheelchair, and from the time those kids are little, they may not have many kids to compete against in that, but they're prepping them to be able to play wheelchair Olympics and basketball. And I think it's a great thing. So I think we have to kind of start to think like not as to because you wouldn't expect a wheelchair basketball player to compete with a basketball player that's of able body, two arms and two legs, right? That wouldn't be fair. So, but maybe when they are young, they are playing there, and as they get to be have the opportunity to compete with their own category, when it becomes important for them, they are able to do that. And I think Special Olympics and Paralympics have done a phenomenal job of raising money, building avenues where literally when I was a kid, it was just beginning. Paralympics wasn't even a thing when I was a kid. That came about like in the 90s, if you remember. Special Olympics was always there, but it really became big in the 80s. Um, and now obviously it's worldwide. So I do think that there's a progression. Are people who are in it now will they be happy with that? Answer is no. They're not going to be happy with that. But I think there are steps to that, and I think ultimately that gets it so it's not a battle between everybody. What is my view on it? What is your view on it? Because the truth is, you want them to play sports for the same reason that we played sports, but it can't may not be in the same competitive environment. That's my step thought on it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's something that we got to figure out, right? If we're going to accept that as if we want to be inclusive, right, and be diverse, and we want to accept all people for what they want to be. Like my big thing with a lot of these topics that I just cannot wrap my head around still, and it does definitely come more from the conservative side. So I'll kind of speak to that is like, why are we so caught up as a country, as human beings, in what other people do that doesn't affect you as a person, right? So like when we talk about things like trans, and we talk about, you know, same-sex marriages or same-sex rights, or like, why does who I love or who you love, why does that grind people's gears so much? Like I still can't wrap my head around that.
I
Like,
think it's religion. I think religion because I'm a
yeah,
born
but
again.
even that, like, I guess my point in that is, okay, so if you're religious, right, and you believe that someone who's in a same-sex relationship is going to go to hell, right, because they're not following this, like, okay, so then I'm going to go to hell. Why do you like, you don't even know me, right? We're talking about people that don't even know each other. Why do you care so much
I agree with that.
about how it affects me? Like we get so caught up in this country, and it's like, and at the end of the day, here's the way that I look at it, right? And I've had this argument with people who are very religious is like, all right, so if we go back into time, and I'll use Catholicism because that's kind of what I know, but I know this is true for other religions, right? With different deviations. So, you know, Jesus is born of the Immaculate Conception, right? So like let's try to wrap our heads around that for starters, right? So
Right.
we're gonna believe this, and Adam and Eve and all this other stuff, right? He brought in lepers, and he embraced them, and he embraced all these different groups of people that people were trying to shun out. So you're telling me right now that if Jesus Christ was on earth right now, that he would be saying to these people, no, you're right, all these other things, we're going to forgive murderers, we're going to forgive pedophiles, we're going to forgive people who steal, but we can't forgive and let same-sex couples or same, we're not going to do that. Like to
I
me
think
it's
it
just,
does. I so my I'll let you finish your point. Um, Now this is coming from me as a born again Christian, right? Which
yep,
probably is but I would say like I'm almost like born again light, like in a sense. My father's Jewish, by the way. So and when you talk with DEI, I would say like where does someone like me fall? A born again Christian, father's Jewish, my mother's an immigrant, was from Indonesia, but she's Dutch Indonesian. I'm Polynesian. I'm 20% Polynesian and Asian. Obviously, the rest is Caucasian, right? And my father's Jewish. I'm born like so. When you start to talk about DEI and opportunities, I'm like, okay, where does someone like myself fall, right? Which is just a conglomerate of different things. Because my mother was literally an immigrant off the boat. Um, so, uh, but going back to what you were talking about, which I think is a really important thing. I think that as I understand it, and I could say I could be wrong, as I understand it, Jesus does not, it's not a situation where he doesn't forgive. I think the issue where everything becomes sticky to me is that, and it's sticky even for me because my father's Jewish, right? Even though I was raised Protestant and I became born again, the sticky becomes the heaven thing. Okay, so I'll give an example, not even using what you're talking about. Okay, I'll use Judaism, right? Born again Christians believe that if you don't accept Jesus Christ as your savior, okay, that you won't go to heaven. So I've taken that as kind of my oath. Now, you question to ask me would be, what do you think is going to happen to your father? Okay, my father obviously is Jewish, and is not going to take um, Jesus Christ as his savior. He obviously knows of Jesus Christ because obviously he's a regular historic. Jesus Christ was Jewish, all those kind of things. He um, uh, acknowledges obviously a lot of the things that he did do. He acknowledges that Christianity is good for the world. But then you say, okay, well, he's not taking that next step. What happens to him? In the same way that you would say, like, what does Jesus say about people who are same-sex married? Does he not forgive? So that part to me is very sticky. Okay. And that I 100% agree with. And I get in a conversation with the guy who played at UConn also, who's a born again like me. And we get in this conversation a lot. And he does not have obviously anyone who is Jewish, and he's much more uh, strict, right? And really like would say, well, they all have to take Jesus Christ in their heart and go and take the path to be able to repent on those things, right? And I'm not sure where I stand on that. You know what I mean? So it's one of the things that's always been hardest for me. I only know that when I was became born again, it changed a lot of positive things in my life. And my father, who is Jewish, has said, like, that was one of the really good things that happened to you because you shifted a lot of the things positively in your life. I wasn't going out and, my only motivation wasn't going out and trying to chase girls and get absolutely as much money as I can get and party. Like a lot of that's changed kind of my thought. So those things were really good. So the question is like, can two things be true at the same time on this? Like, can something that helped your life and is going to set you on a right path also possibly be detrimental to somebody else in your thoughts as to with them? And my thing is, I don't know the answer to that. You know what I mean? Like, I understand that there is a level of, I don't want to use the word hypocrisy because people throw that around. I want to say confusion as to what would Jesus do.
Yeah, I mean, I think confusion is good. I even would say that I find a lot of people's very stringent beliefs and what they're willing to forgive and overlook hypocrisy, right? Because
Okay, yep, fair,
because
fair.
I can go sit at church and I could be next to a registered pedophile, right? Now they're still accepting Jesus. I'm accepting Jesus. We both can repent, but my repent based off of what I'm repenting for is very different than that. Yet I feel my level of where should be accepted into heaven is very, very different, right? So like I think there's so many different levels. And I guess my overarching point with that kind of I feel like flows into politics because we're talking about a lot of stuff like liberal versus conservative. A lot of the liberal views that people kind of gravitate towards are that they are more accepting of different groups of people, where historically conservatives aren't, right? Man marries woman, man stays man, woman stays woman. That you do this and you're following what the American values are, but we're really talking about religion. And so when we have in there as a right your freedom of religion and what you believe in, what you're telling me is you're saying that is something, but you're not actually acting like it is a right because you're trying to penalize and group people and exclude people based off of what that belief is, right? So it is a little bit of hypocrisy because you can't tell me, well, I have the freedom of speech, I have the freedom of religion. Okay, but if your religion doesn't match mine, then we're going to try to put you in this other bucket and not accept you, right? So
One of the things I do think that has changed in at least the conservative party versus the uh, Republican Party
liberal,
versus
yep.
Democrats is that's one of the things that I think that has changed. So if you're taking conservative party via, I don't know, maybe like before Reagan. I think Reagan may have began to change kind of a lot of the things that were important in a conservative party. But let's say before Reagan, you would say I would agree with you. And if I fast forward 40 years, I would say that it's shifting slightly. I'm curious your thoughts on this. So I think it's shifting a little bit differently. So I think this is my thoughts that more conservatives think a lot like I do. Okay, they might be religiously conservative. They might are like, hey, you know what? Whatever person the other person wants to marry is fine. You know what I mean? Um, if I accept Jesus, this other person does. That's not for them. That's okay. Um, and I think the Conservative Party is much more. I use a guy. There's a guy named Ruben. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a big conservative. Okay, he's a homosexual. He's married to a man, and he's a huge. He talks a ton about it. I encourage Dave Rubin. I encourage you to try and watch some stuff because I think it's in, especially his older stuff. Now he probably talks less about it, but if you go back like 4 or 5 years, like around the pandemic and stuff like that, when he went from Democrat to Republican, um, his eyes got opened up by, oh God, I can't think of his name now off the top of my head. I'll get it to you. But he's a conservative. He's African American. He's out of California. He's a brilliant guy. And he was on his podcast to talk about him. And he was a Democrat at the time. And this guy was a conservative. And he wanted to battle him. And the guy kind of changed his mind and started to change his mind. So I think conservative parties, Republicans have gone a lot more to, hey, I believe this, but we want people who in general feel that we should be doing the right thing and treating people fairly. Okay. Now DEI is different to me than treating people fairly. I don't know if that makes sense, but that DEI is specifically grabbing specific groups depending off a certain parameters, right? And treat people fairly is everybody, no matter who they are. And my thing on that is I think the Republicans have gone really hard to try and address those flaws where I feel like the Democrat Party is people marching and attacking Jewish people on the streets at Columbia University because they're Jewish, and those people are Democrats. And some of them are saying they support Hamas, who are terrorists, and support Palestine. And then if you go ask them, what are you supporting? They don't even know what they're talking about. So
well, that's the biggest issue, right? Is lack of education, right?
Absolutely.
Is people, and that's kind of basically what I was overarching trying to say is that I'm not saying that the Democratic Party is actually supporting all these groups and doing that, but it's kind of been the carrot that they dangle because you have the Conservative Party that doesn't necessarily come out and say, okay, yes, we support this. We're going to let you do whatever you want and blah, 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 blah. Right. So I think my overarching thing is that I really just believe that in this country specifically, because if you go to other countries, and I've lived in other countries, they are highly, highly educated from a young age on exactly what their country is about, exactly what their laws and regulations are, how it affects them, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like in the United States, we've become so polarized and divided into two separate parties that I think that most people that you would talk to from both sides would actually, the majority of people are probably really moderate, right? Like I agree with this on this side and I agree with this on this side. There's things I like about this. There's things I like about that. How can we all come together and find that? And I think Kennedy, I've listened to a bunch of his stuff recently, like over the last 6-7 months. And I actually feel like he is very moderate, right? Like when you listen to his stuff, now obviously he's taken a stand and he's moved more to the conservative side for the election.
So was Bill Clinton.
Okay? Correct.
Like I was a Bill Clinton, when I went to college, I was a Democrat. Okay, because my family was, and Bill Clinton, I always thought was fairly moderate. He was from Arkansas, in order to get elected in Arkansas, okay, which is going to be a conservative place in general, he had to be fairly moderate to become governor there originally.
Yep.
Otherwise, he wasn't going to become governor as a Democrat. Okay. So he had to be fairly moderate. So that's the thing. So I feel like, listen, I feel like other than a couple of issues, like you would probably say fiscally, I'm probably pretty conservative. Um, Although I wish I lived my life conservative fiscally, but as far as my values are, because everyone seems to spend every dollar I get, uh, you know. But
Which is
it's
most people, but
right, which is most people. Um, but as far as some of the, like socially, like I was very socially like, hey, do whatever the heck you want. Doesn't matter to me. Like what I like to do is maybe different than what, and I think I'm still socially that way. What I think it is that that thought process has become less and less middle of the road. So like I feel like people on the left, and I would love at one point to like have like that talk with people that are much more to the left, right? Because you're in the middle. So someone who's much more to the left to say I'm wrong. But I feel like people on the left are like, no, you have to support DEI, or you are not a good person. You have to support this, or else you're not a good person, right? And to me, it's not about who's a good person, who isn't a good person. Like both sides probably have plenty of people that are great people. Both sides probably have plenty of people that are bad people, right? And and you're going to have that. And I would say in any group, race, ethnicity, you're going to have good people and bad people. It doesn't matter what group you're in. Okay, nobody's infallible from that standpoint. So, so you're going to have that. It becomes, do we which group blames for what, right? That's kind of what it's become. This group blames the other group for this. The other group blames this group for that. I think you're in a great place as far as from being a moderate because both parties want your vote, Maria. You're
I
the most
know.
you're the
You know,
most coveted asset in the world.
and here's like, and the funny part for me is like, I've always been like this when I was since I was young. I think some of us like we all have to understand that we do have innate things that we were just, you're born with. Yes, of course, environment, circumstance can change you. I've always been like, love everybody, right? Accept everybody for who they are. If you want to make a decision that doesn't directly affect me or somebody that I love, that I don't agree with, I'm not really getting all up in arms about it, right? And I think
Right.
that's part of the point too is like I think sometimes on the liberal side if you're not getting up in arms about stuff, then you're not being a good enough liberal. And I think on the conservative side if you're not getting up in arms about certain stuff, you're not a good conservative, right? So for me I'm like, well, I'm in the middle because I am fiscally more conservative. I agree with you on that. There are a lot of things that on the conservative side that I agree with in terms of, foreign policies and all of this other stuff. But there are some domestic and some socially, I'm a little bit more liberal, right?
Right, right.
I would actually say that's one of, I don't want to say it's the only thing that I'm more liberal on, but it's the one that comes up in conversation the most. But at the end of the day, do I really feel like social stuff is impacting our federal government? I don't. I just really don't. And I just would love to see us get to a point in this country where we stop worrying about what other people are doing that doesn't affect us personally, right? Like why doesn't that bother you? Well, I don't know because it's not it doesn't affect me. Why do I care? Go live your life. Right? We're all here. We're all making our own decisions. We all have to deal with the consequences at the end of the day and at the end of the road and wherever we believe we're going afterwards is your prerogative. So I never get into a lot of different conversations of like I'm not here to change anybody's mind, right?
Right.
I'm not here to change your belief system. I'm just here to accept you for who you are. And if you're someone that I don't want to be around because of a certain belief or because of the choices that you're making, then it's my prerogative not to be, right? Like I'm
I
not
think that I think, believe it or not, that has become more of a conservative. I know it's going to sound crazy. That's become more of a conservative view than a Democrat view.
Well, that's what my dad says, right? So my dad
Right.
is very similar to you. Like, so if you have a conversation with him, he was raised Democrat,
Right.
right? And he says that the conservative party is like the old Democrats. Like it's
Correct.
kind of, and I don't
That's
see
what my
that as
dad
much.
thinks too.
I don't see that as much because I wasn't old enough back then to live through that regime. But I think that what I hate about politics right now, and this is my overarching thing, and then let's talk about something more fun for a second. Um,
This is fun.
yeah, I know you love it. I hate talking about politics. I hate talking about religion because they're
I'm
just always
teasing you.
sticky
I'm
points.
teasing you.
And you're never gonna listen. You're never gonna please everybody or agree with
Right.
everybody. But what I hate right now is how divisive both parties have made everything that's going on, and both are responsible in their own ways for that
Sure.
division. I don't think it falls on one or the other. And I hate, like, you can lose friends, you can lose followers, you can lose, like,
Yep.
so I stay very gray. And not because I'm afraid to take a stand either way. It's because I've just always seen both sides, right? Like, there's always, like, I always say, in a truth, there's one person's story, there's the other person's story, right? Somewhere in the middle is probably the truth, right?
Right.
And so I just kind of live my life that way of kind of just trying to be inclusive, right? Like, why would we not all want diversity? Why would we not all want equity or inclusion? Of course we do. And that it's never going to be perfect because everybody's,
I think everybody wants DEI, but how the application of it done is
yep.
where people have the issues with it. So
Well, people are sticky on the stuff that's sticky for them, right?
I think well, I mean, I'm a meritocracy person, right? So if you're a meritocracy person, that's just an in general best performer, right? So if you're talking job performer, like if you were um, this happens a lot, obviously, in education. So, because there's a heavy component with DEI, and you don't have to comment on it because you work in education, so I don't want you to get yourself in any trouble. But what I do think is um, an issue in DEI. And listen, I get in this argument. My sister's the athletic director of UMass Boston, by the way.
Yeah,
So,
we'll be playing them.
yep. So she's the athletic director there. I'll make sure if you guys playing there, that she goes over and says hello to you. But it's I get in this discussion with her a lot, and my always thing is that if I was hiring an assistant coach for any sport, I don't care who they are, I want the best person. So that's always been, and almost every coach would say the same thing, right? Um, and I wouldn't want someone jammed down my throat for any reason, whatever the reason is, son of somebody, because they're African American, whatever the reason is. I want the best person, right? So if that best person happens to be black, great. If that person happens to be the son of someone that's an image, great. If it's not someone like that, great. But I don't want someone jammed down my throat for a specific reason. I want to be able to choose the very best person, and that's just my thought. But it really isn't um, um, anything for me, just me, anything other than that. And I think that if you operate large levels like government, eventually, if you operate it where you have to choose somebody for certain reasons, eventually you will make a mistake. Okay. And you just hope that mistake is a small mistake, not a big mistake. And that to me was where potentially you could go many, many years with it being completely harmless. Nothing bad happens. But if you do it in a situation, I'll use the military, for example. Military, choose the wrong general for that reason. Okay. That to me is dangerous to foreign policy, right? Um, and so that's kind of some of the things that I look at from that standpoint. Outside of that, I really don't. I agree. Like diversity is great. Diversity of thought is great. Different opinions are great. It makes you better in a company, in a work environment. But it doesn't have to be diversity just because of how they look. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah, I think you hit something really important, and I 100% agree. Like, I'm really big on like who's the best person for the job, right? Like, who's going to represent this role in the best way possible, who's also qualified to do it. And it really shouldn't matter who they are or what. It's almost like you should have like blind hiring, right? Like, retract the name, retract like all the other stuff, you know what I
I
mean? And
agree with
like
that. Yeah.
just blind hire based off of qualifications, impact, and who's going to represent the role in the best way. I think there's way too much nepotism in this country in general. We see it in sports all the time. It's, there we can go into a gazillion different nepotism
Yeah,
conversations
yeah, yeah.
there.
And sometimes they hire someone in nepotism and they're right. The guy is good or girl.
I gotcha.
Sometimes they're right.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. And
But there's a
sometimes
lot of
they're
times,
wildly wrong. Sometimes they're wildly wrong. That's
but
that's my point on it
but as
shouldn't
long
be
as, I guess for me, is as long as they're doing their due diligence
correct.
to make sure, like, you shouldn't just get a job. Like, I'll use an example, and this can kind of switch us, I guess, over to sports for a second. But like,
Sure.
so the WNBA, the Washington Mystics, right? They hire Mike Tebow as the general manager. First thing Mike Tebow does as general manager is hire his son as the head coach, right? They get Elena Deladon, who's a great talent, whatever. She realizes after like 2 years, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go live my life and do other things and represent different things, whatever. The son was in no way qualified to take on that role. He'd never been a head coach before. He had worked with his dad on some different teams, but he never like worked towards it to get it, right? So they just announced the other day, the Washington Mystics just had another horrific season. So they fired Mike and they fired his son. Just got rid of both. And like our whole conversation in my different chat groups is like, oh, he's a Nepo baby. Like he never should have gotten that role. Is like, and so I don't mind that Mike is the general manager because he's qualified for that role. His son, he should have put his son there with a different head coach for a year or two to learn and do whatever. But now what this has done, right, is it's made the organization look silly, in my opinion, because he wasn't the right guy for the job. Not only that, but you now just did a disservice to all of these athletes that have played there for the last couple of years that didn't get the best experience or exposure or growth or whatever for this program. So I think again, if they would have interviewed 10 people and his son was the best person that they felt at the time for the job, great, have at it. Listen, you could think at the time that they're the best person for the job and they're the most qualified, and they still end up being the worst coach ever.
Right.
But did you
100%.
do your due diligence to make sure? And the answer in that scenario was no. And I think in a lot of scenarios, the answer is no, right? And that's our problem, is that when you jump to those conclusions and you give and award people moving up in the hierarchy that haven't earned it, you create like this weird, I don't know how to describe it, but like this, people hate that,
I
It's
agree with
like,
that. And I think that's where some of the DEI issues come in.
mhm,
So not I always say it's not DEI the words, because the words, if you don't agree with that, there's probably something wrong with you. But
mhm.
the actions, right? So you're 100% right. So I believe here's my thought process on like stuff like nepotism or hiring someone that's like your race or something like that. If you own the business, if you're the owner, Dave Schuman or Maria Conlon Inc., right?
Mhm.
I can hire whoever I damn well please. Okay, private company, not public company, because if you're the owner, it's a public company, different situation. Private company, I can hire my son. I can if I wanted to hire Pacific Islanders only because that's part of my heritage. I own the company. People complain all they want. It's just like I always say, like you go in a pizza shop, right? And a lot of times the guy who's been there for 50 years, he wants his son to take over the business. A lot of times he doesn't want to, but they have the son working there or the family working there. They eventually take over the business. They own that business. They could do whatever the hell they damn well please, right? They can't discriminate against somebody, but they could hire whoever they want. When you're in a company and it's owned by somebody else, so if Maria Conlon owns the Mystics and she's the owner of it, and you hire a general manager and he takes it upon himself, maybe without your consent, to hire a family member, and that affects my business, there's an issue there, right? So that I 100% agree with. And I think in those cases, if you do think your son is the best person for a job, okay, or if you want to go out of your way to hire someone that is less qualified for some reason, whether it's race, ethnicity, nepotism, any kind of reason, right? Because you wanted to advance somebody, you should have a search committee that is with you, as far as that's an independent search committee that says, okay, here are the guys who we think are maybe more qualified to hire, but we're okay with you hiring this less qualified person for these reasons. And if you choose to hire that less qualified person, know that these are the concerns we have, and we will tell the owner these are the concerns we have. And if he green lights to hire, he green lights to hire, right? I think that's a much better way to handle it, because that way, okay, a search committee went through. Now, maybe they think the person that you want to hire is the best person. Great. That's easy. But if they don't, and you still want to hire that person, that should go up to the person that's either the owner or the person who is the CEO, right? So they know the reasoning behind it, because they could have that sit down. Because in that case, that person is going to be fired probably a lot quicker if it doesn't work out than 2 years. It's probably going to be 6 months, right? So I think that's a better process. That would potentially solve someone's decision. And I think the person hiring probably would have done what you said, would have said, you know what, you're going to be an assistant for 2 years. And if you progress the way that we think you should progress, then you'll be ready. You'll be ready for that job. But after the committee's conversations with me, you know what, if I hire you, I'm really going way too far out on a limb. I'm really going way too far out on a limb. And it's actually going to affect our family because I'll get fired. So it's actually going to affect all of us negatively. So I think I think that's a better way of doing it. Now, listen, at low levels, high school, Division III, that's going to be a lot harder to do, a lot harder. But at high levels, I think that's a much, much better way of handling it. Government, big corporations, big universities, obviously WNBA teams, because it does affect those players, and it does affect their careers, and it affects what other coaches may perceive on their abilities, right? They may play terrible underneath XYZ person. And, sometimes it's their fault. Sometimes it's not their fault. I mean, that's the truth. That's why when people talk about transfer portal and NIL, I'm like, well, it's case by case. Sometimes it is the coach. That's the reality. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's them. Things aren't always cut and dry. But I think your point is really, really, really well taken and really valid.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm just, again, I'm old school, and you work for what you got. I laugh because I'm like, I see these people get some of these jobs in pro or head college coaching jobs, and they've never coached a day in their life, right? And you coach. I always say, if you can coach high school, you can coach any level, right? Yep. You can, because you're making stuff out of nothing. I'm zero impressed with someone who can step into a Division I role that has 4 or 5 first team All-Americans, or just even has top 100 kids on their team, and now they can put some stuff together. And then they fail after 4 or 5 years because they have no real like coaching experience. I don't know. So it's always like a thorn in my side because I just feel like I'm a big earn what you get, like start from the bottom, work your way up person. I know that's not always true. Like you've seen really successful coaches that have kind of jumped right in and they're great and they're whatever. Like look at Becky Hammond, who I think is probably the best WNBA coach that we have. But what did she do? She was smart and she went and she was a student under Greg Popovich for
Yep.
years before she decided to go over and do it on her own. Like, hey, I'm going to go learn from the best and then I'm going to do it. And I just feel like some of the nepotism and some of the other stuff has taken that away. Like, just because you're an unbelievable basketball player or an unbelievable football player or whatever does not mean that you're going to be an unbelievable coach. Like 1+1 does not equal 2 there, in my opinion. I think in a rare circumstance, it can, but in most circumstances, it doesn't because
No, you're right.
just because you can do something doesn't mean you can teach something, right? Like I could be really, really good at math. Doesn't mean I'd be a good math teacher, you know?
Right, because
So I don't know.
there's patience. Like that math example is a great example because, like as a coach, I think I've had pretty good patience of like trying to get guys better. But like with respect to like learning, I was always really good at math, and I struggle when someone can't do things in math to explain it to them
Yep.
because to me it's just like I just add it up in my head. It's done. And my father was better than me. He was the same way. Like he cannot understand why you can't just understand how to do a certain times table in your head and come up with the answer. Just can't understand it or add properly. So I've always had a hard time try to explain that, like even to my own son, like, and he's really good at math too. So he happens, but like if I were to explain, I don't think I could do it. I don't think I could teach math because it would drive me. Basic math would drive me nuts if there was a kid is not understanding how to go through the mathematical process and figure it out. It would just drive me nuts. I couldn't teach it. Whereas football or sport and sports in general, even though I was a very good athlete, I can understand where a kid is coming from where they don't know what to do. For some reason, that resonates with me where math would not, like it would not resonate for me. I would
Right.
not be able to teach it. But I
Well,
could,
and think about what we're talking about too, right? Like, okay, so if you want to be a math teacher, what do you have to do? You got to go to college for math, right? You have to go out and student teach math. Like you're basically starting at the bottom before you can work up. And then if you want to be a professor of math, right, and get your doctorate and all this other stuff, like you have to teach it then for years in order to get to that level. And you have to do that with anything. Think about a doctor, right? You want to be a doctor, you got to go to school, then you got to go to med school, right? Then you got to go and be an intern, make no money and work all these crazy hours and do all this stuff before you get to be a medical doctor and actually treat patients. But when I look at sports, right? You don't need to have any credentials. By the way, playing a sport, right? Like I can go play doctor, right? I can
mhm.
go play doctor and like do all this stuff and I can check whatever. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be qualified to be a doctor. So in sports, we've kind of gotten to this point where your qualification is the doing of it, not the actual like application of teaching and growing it, right? So for me, I'm like, I can't under I can't understand it.
Why
Like
is
you
it
have to
not?
student teach,
Yeah, I
right?
wonder if colleges have not. Maybe I guess it's pretty close to being its own industry. Meaning like it's every school has obviously sports. I'm talking about high school level. Every college has sports, and a lot of those jobs are more and more becoming full time. I'm not just talking about the highest level where they are, but even at the Division three, more and more are going to become full time. That's always going to continue to grow. Obviously, there's in professional sports and Division one sports. Besides coaching, there's all these other roles that are really important, right? I always wondered why no university has said, I'm going to make coaching a major, sports coaching specifically, not coaching because there's life coaches and all this stuff. I
Well,
mean,
yeah.
sports coaching.
And
A
they try to get around it, right? Because they'll do like you could take a leadership course, right? Or you could take a psychology course, which yes, you need all of those, have some knowledge of some of those things to be able to deal with it. But that's kind of where I'm going at with this is that for almost every other profession out there, you have to go through testing and trial and error and start from the bottom with student teaching and mentor underneath other people and watch what they do before you can go on this runway yourself. But for some reason in the sports world, it's good enough just to say, hey, I played 4 years of college basketball.
crazy.
Like, and like, listen, I'm not saying he won't make a good coach, right? But I laugh at like the JJ Redick thing.
Right,
Like,
right.
like he was a rec coach who had a podcast, who was an announcer, who is now the head coach of the Los Angeles Lakers. Make it make sense. Now, he could end up being one of the greatest coaches of all time.
Yeah.
I don't know, right?
And he's LeBron's friend. He's
Yeah.
friends with LeBron.
In time, we will figure that out. But how do you substantiate that as a hire? Like, show me the granular work that he had to put in that makes him qualified to now run this organization from a coaching perspective. So I think your point on like, why is that not a major? Because I also believe, right? I think that if you can coach one thing, you can coach almost anything. And what I mean by that is, I don't mean the technical stuff. Like if you put me on the sidelines as a football coach, I'm not going to necessarily know like what plays and all of that, but I can coach, I can motivate, right? I can lead. Now, the technical aspect of it, I'd have to learn. But where do you learn those things that I just mentioned? Like how to resonate and relate to kids. How do you deal with parents? How do you deal with this and that? And all, like, there's so many different layers to being a coach and running a program that I think we're missing the boat somewhere on that, right? Like there's just gotta be, and that's why a lot of coaches are losing their jobs.
Even if it's so like people who do like mechanics or guys who are electricians, right? They don't go necessarily to a 4-year college. They go to electrician school. They go to
a tech school. They learn the trade.
Even if you were to look at coaching from that aspect, there's still nothing even there. So
No.
That's the amazing thing. So like even electricians and mechanics, okay, which is an education that is not required to go to college, even they have schools that they have to go to and get certified on before they could go and touch any car, period. End of story. You know, like even look, when I was an NFL agent for 6 years, I had to take their course, okay, and study their materials and pass their test with a certain score in order to be an NFL agent. And then I also had to apply at each state that I was going to practice being an agent at. If I represented you in Texas, I had to be an agent in Texas. Okay. So I had to apply for that. So I had to apply for those licenses beyond that, right? The only license you ever have to apply for as a coach, which is the funniest of all, is substitute teacher. If you're not a teacher, you have to be a substitute teacher to be a coach. You never teach, obviously. You just have you coach. It's one of the craziest things. Or we need your teaching certificate. Well, what does that like? I find it, it's funny. Old school coaches always say, coaches are teachers. And I always say this. I say, yeah, but they teach. Coaches do teach. Okay. But a classroom is very different than a coach. Go ahead and go into a classroom and try to motivate the kid who's slouching in his chair by getting him hyped up or having him do push-ups or something. He's going to give you the finger. Okay. I mean, that's a different world. Those are two different worlds. They're related. but they're different. Okay. An electrician works on a house, so does a roofer. Okay. They're needed to build a house, but you got to have a roofer's license in order to be a roofer. You got to have an electrician's license in order to be an electrician. I think in today's age, it's crazy that they say it's just to, honestly, it's just so they don't have to pay coaches. That's it. So they don't have to pay them a salary. So
Yeah.
they say, you got to be a teacher, and that's how we'll give you a salary versus doing it being a coach. And we'll stick you in a classroom where a lot of these guys don't want to be. Okay. Take phys ed teachers out of that because phys ed teachers usually like just enjoy being phys ed teachers. But like guys who want to be a coach, and let's say they're like, oh, well, I got a math degree. I like teaching math, but I'd really rather coach. But I got to teach math for 8 hours, make believe I'm a math teacher, and just so I could coach football or
Yeah.
basketball. I think that's crazy.
It's nuts. And like the funny part to me is like, and I went through this obviously getting hired here, and I've had other friends like you go to, if you're a high school coach or you're a prep school coach and you want to go apply to coach in college at whatever level, one of the first qualifications that they'll throw out there is, okay, well, you have to have 3 years experience coaching at the college level. And in my head, I'm like, well, wait a second. How does that, why is that the foundation? Because how are you going to be a coach in college if you've never been a coach before, period? And if you've never been a coach before, period, how could you just jump into a college role, right? So to me, it's like the natural progression with coaching is like backwards almost, right? So, okay. So I've been coaching high school. Yeah, I had enough years of college coaching experience in other different ways, right? So that made me more qualified to be a head coach than the fact that I've already been a head coach for the last 6 years and run successful programs. It was just at a lower thing. But it's almost like saying, well, you can only go apply to get your master's if you have a master's in something else. Well, how do I get my master's without getting my undergrad? Right? So the undergrad is not a requirement, but the master's is. Like, how does that even make sense? So like with coaching, I almost feel like it should be a prerequisite that you have to go and coach the youth, or you have to go and coach high school before you go and coach college. Now, if you look at Gino and you look at Hurley, right, at UConn, they're two perfect examples. They started at high school and then worked their way up. Hurley even more than Gino, right? Because he coached high
Right.
school and then he ended up at Virginia and then he got the UConn job, whatever. But Hurley started at high school, then he went to prep school, then he went Division III, then he went Division II, then he got a D1 job at Rhode Island, and then he ended up over at UConn. So now at this point, you've said, okay, this guy has coached and coached and coached and coached all different levels and been successful at all different levels. This is the guy that we want, right? Versus, okay, I just graduated from Duke. I went and I've been a broadcaster for a couple of years. I played in the league a couple of years. Yep, I'm ready to go run the Los Angeles Lakers.
It's crazy.
It's like, it's nutty. It's totally nutty.
It's crazy. And what happens is if they're successful, they'll point to that and say, oh, that's the path,
Well, and the problem is that that's happened, right? Like we've had people do that and have been successful. And like I said before, though, those are outliers. That's not the norm, right? We get so fixated on outliers that we forget, like, like it'd be like saying like, okay, I'm going to compare people who compare Bronny James to LeBron. I'm like, stop it. He's a complete outlier. He's a freak athlete. He's totally different and special. You can't do that. You can't compare normal to the outlier. It's not realistic, right? So there's got to be some way that we can build something that says, okay, if you want to be a coach, what do you need to do? What are those parameters? What do you need to learn? And then now let's train that person. And if they're the right fit and they can do, because by the way, you can be fairly educated on all the things about coaching. Still doesn't mean that you're going to be a good coach. Right.
Absolutely. It's also, it's funny because the thing with Bronny, I always and LeBron, LeBron will never understand what Bronny has to go through because literally I've watched every documentary on LeBron. I've watched like all the different things they've ever, from the time he was young. Like LeBron deserves credit for this as an athlete. Like he was willing to do what he needed to do. He was obviously a freak beyond freaks, right? And athletically, and he could do things by practicing it and then doing it. And Bronny is not LeBron. He cannot do those things it doesn't mean he's not a very good player, but it means like he's almost set up for failure, which I think is tough because that's an example of them bringing him in just because it's his son. And the truth is, if he was given more an opportunity to be seasoned, maybe he would get to where he needed to be. But he's completely thrown into a situation where he's never even going to get that opportunity because he's thrown in. It's like taking your kid and throwing him in four age groups ahead of him, or her, right? Like your daughter's 12. It's like saying I'm going to play her right now against 18-year-olds and she's not ready. Like not only is she going to fail, but she's going to become discouraged and she's not going to want to play sport. Like period.
Like the funny part about the Brownie situation, and then I have like 2 minutes I got to run. This guy was averaging 3.5 points in college. He Correct. Wasn't even like killing it in college. It'd be one thing if he was like averaging 28, 30, 30 points a game, 5 or 6 assists, a couple steals, a couple blocks, a couple rebounds. Like that was he wasn't even the best player on his college team. And now you're throwing him into the NBA. He really should be in the G League, or he should still be in college.
Probably still be in college, is my opinion. Probably even not even have started at USC, to be honest. Like he would have been an example of a guy who should have played at like UC Irvine for 2 years. And if he dominated, now you go over to USC and then he can dominate there and then go to the G League, then the NBA. Like that would be his path. But his path now is like, I just, but you're right. There's a lot more of that now. And that's also the issue when I think we start to cloud like what our process is like. And I agree that coaching, it's time for coaching to have a standard educational system to be a coach, whatever their path is, because it'll make better coaches. Honestly, I think you'll have a lot less coaches that will fail for extraneous reasons versus losing. Like getting fired because you lose, that's probably the only reason why you should be getting fired as a coach, right? Because you're not quite able to get your guys to win. You shouldn't be getting fired because you're organizationally terrible or you don't know how to recruit or you're hiring incorrectly or you don't know how to deal with parents or you don't know how to deal with players. Like that could be learned. That's the thing.
That doesn't listen, coaching is all of those things, which is the sad part, right? Like you do have to be able to do all of that stuff. And the problem is again, that's why if that was a curriculum that people could learn, right? Like it's easy to learn that stuff. So learn it before you become a coach, because a lot of the stuff that we know makes great coaches, you kind of learn on the fly, right? Like you're thrown into a situation and you either sink or swim, you go to recruit a kid. And by the way, coaching specifically in college is not just about winning or losing anymore. It's about retention. It is about recruiting. It's about raising money. I only disagree with that because of the environment that we're in.
Right.
So think about that. Before, yes, it was that black and white. You won, you stayed. You lost, you leave. Now you have to win and you have to retain and you have to recruit and you have to make sure people are in the portal and you got to make sure that there's enough NIL money, all these different things. It's impossible, especially with zero experience. So imagine doing all of that I just said, and you're a brand new coach, head coach to the sport.
Right.
You have zero head coaching experience before.
What about Saban? Saban, he basically said to himself, I don't want to learn how to deal with the transfer portal in this extreme way
Yep.
and the NIL. He didn't say, I don't know how to coach football anymore.
No.
I don't know how to manage people. I don't want to learn how to re-recruit my roster. I don't
Correct.
want to learn the skill sets to understand NIL and how it's going to work. And I don't want to take the time at 70 years old to understand how to master the transfer portal. And if he was 25, he would be willing to learn that and take an education course on it, right?
Yep.
And get some real works. At 72, he's a perfect example because it's glaring. Everybody else wants to learn it on the fly because they want the job. Saban basically said, there's a learning requirement because he's so linear, Saban. There's a learning requirement. That learning requirement is not something that I feel like doing at this point in my career. I'm not going to do it. I'm
And
not
I'm
going to
telling you, I said this last week. I think we're going to see more and more of that because it's just becoming too much.
Yep. Jeff Hafley, who's good, I'm good friends with, um, went to the NFL, left Boston College as their head coach. He
Yep.
did not want to deal with it. He did not. He did not want to do. He just went back to the NFL. He was in the NFL before. He went to Ohio State for one. Thought he wanted to be a head coach of college. Went back, Ohio State to be DC, and then went to Boston College. And then when the transfer portal and NAL became the thing, he just didn't want to do it, man. He's a young guy. He might be younger than me. I think he's a few years younger than me, and he's a young guy. And he's like, I'll just go back to the NFL. I know what that animal is. I
Yep.
coach my players. I'm the DC. I coach them. I scheme. That's it. I coach. You know. But you're right. Now, Maria, the key for you before I let you go is you're going to develop the curriculum
I'm going to add another job to my other
and,
six.
and the business, and I'll be your president and develop that structure for you. Once you develop everything on
I
there,
mean, listen,
I'll come on board with you.
it's not a bad idea. It would
Is it?
take a lot. It would take a lot of
It would
focus
take a lot.
groups. Um,
It would take resources. It would take
yeah.
you need to bring on a big investor that's willing to ride losses because you're gonna
Yep.
have losses for a while.
Yep.
But I actually think eventually, yes, 100%. It eventually that's actually a gold mine because so many of these young guys, we interviewed one on this other podcast I do with this guy Derek, that's a coach at high school, and we interviewed a student assistant at a Division I school, and oh no, Division II school. I'm sorry, and he was talking about how he decided to become a coach. He got hurt, and he was like, I love football. I want to coach." Literally, he's been a student assistant for like 2 years. He is doing on the job training. There's a lot of those people now that want, but if there was actually a place for them actually to go learn without them having to for free, you know what I'm saying? They're coaching for free.
Yeah.
There's no degree at the end of it. There's no guarantee at the end of it. They're there hoping at some point it turns into something, So there
But
is a
think
way.
about how
Anyway,
much more attractive these kids would be
yes.
to hire if they had just gone through. And I don't think it needs to be a 4-year track. I think to your
Nope.
point, it could be like a tech school type degree or like an associate's type thing. But like you have an associate's in coaching. What does that mean? Okay. So you're educated on strength and conditioning, you're educated on nutrition, you're educated on social media, on all the different technical things, budgeting, fundraising, NIL, transfer portal, right? Now, some of this stuff, if you want to be a high school coach, who cares? You don't need it, right? But why not be educated on all of it and let it trickle down, right? Parent, difficult conversations, understanding that like you should never be alone with an athlete having a difficult conversation. Like that's one you don't want to learn on the fly, right? Because you could put yourself in a really how to set boundaries and expectations. And then, okay, now you learn the overarching thing of being a coach. Great. What sport do you want to coach? Okay, now that's the next part of the curriculum, right?
Yep.
I want to coach, but I want to major in football. Okay, cool. And now you partner with coaches on campus or coaches near you, right? On, okay, well, who wants a student assistant? And they start off like basically being a manager, right? And now you can teach them how to break down film. You can teach them how to do personal development for positional stuff. Like, how do you learn all that stuff if you're not like, because a head coach, like I take the time to teach my assistants, but like most head coaches are not going to, they don't want to do that. They're just going to say, forget it, I'm going to do it myself. Right. What are they looking for? How do we get on synergy and pull scouts and do all this other stuff? Like, if that was an actual course and kids could learn this ahead of time, how much easier would it be to pick up these student assistants now that look at they're getting their clinical hours right in the trenches with the team. They're bought in, they understand how to deal with certain situations, and maybe they realize, okay, well, I don't like this coaching style, but I like this one. And they start to mold who they are as a coach for that next level.
You know what else I think too? Your professor walks in and it's Nick Saban, or your professor walks in and it's Gino Ariema. Like legitimately, those are when these guys retire, those are things for them to do because they're all itching to do something. They can say whatever they want, you know, but they're not going to sit in the office that the university gives them and just hang out. Like Jim Calhoun couldn't do it. Like he turned around and started coaching Division III. They're like, hey, you're going to have this office. You're going to hang out. He turned around. He's coaching at St. Joe's, like, so you can give them an opportunity to do some really cool things, and
The adjunct professors.
Absolutely.
Like, you could even take some really qualified high school coaches that coached for 30, 35 years, right? And now they're teaching, like, what does that look like? What's the pyramid of success? What's your why? What do you want your values to be as a coach? What type of kid? What kind of offenses do you like? How do you figure out what that is? So I just think that is necessary at some point. I'm not saying that I want to tackle that personally because
no, I know what you're saying. You're 100% right.
Yeah.
There is zero doubt it's needed because you see, like, the coaching profession. There's a lot of glory in it. It used to be like in the 90s and 2000s. One of the reasons why I didn't go BJ when they asked me to, I was like, man, like, there's no real money in this. Like, I'm, and obviously I had zero foresight, but there's, what am I going to do this for? And, and even my own coaches were like, dude, the life, it's not worth it for the amount of money. Who would have ever known that guys would be getting paid $10 million a year? And look, they're talking about Deion Sanders, who obviously took an alternative path as a coach. Deion Sanders being the first $300 million coach. That's what they're talking about. So, I mean, 30 years ago, would you ever thought that would even possible?
No.
Coach would make.
And like, listen, it's depending on the level, and I think that's where this can get dicey. But like, okay, so then maybe coaching is a minor. Maybe it's not even a major, right? Because if you only want to coach high school, okay, you're going to need another form of income, right? So, okay, now you want to be an education major. My minor's in coaching. Perfect, great, right? Or I want to go into broadcasting, but I want my minor to be coaching, just in case, right? So I at least got the foundation. And you could do that with literally anything. Like, okay, I want to go into finance, but I want to coach high school basketball on the side. Okay, great. That's your minor.
You know what, Maria? One of the things when you brought up broadcasting used to be like coaching one. So it used to be, that's why there's so many guys from Syracuse that are in broadcast, because they were the first really university that did broadcasting as one of their majors. Now it's widespread. Okay. Yeah. But Syracuse was one of the first because I remember in the like late 90s, I went to a school called Connecticut School of Broadcasting. I took classes there because I thought I might want to do broadcasting. And that was like the only thing around. But what ended up happening was university started doing what Syracuse did and having broadcasting because the industry grew so much. Production, not just being on air, but production, TV, obviously now internet. And coaching is is the same exact way, going in the same exact direction.
But broadcasting is a little similar, and this is the last thing I'll say, I promise, because you got people that are getting hired for broadcasting gigs that have zero broadcasting experience. Like, listen, I love Tom Brady.
That's true.
He's a great quarterback. He is horrible.
Agreed.
Broadcaster. But of course he is, because he was a great quarterback and he knows the game, doesn't mean he's going to make a great analysis of the game live on television. He has no training in it. But again, it's the same thing. It's like, oh, but it's Tom Brady. It's going to jack up our ratings. Really? All I do is hear about people bitching about how horrible he is as a broadcaster.
100% right. Yeah,
You know?
you're right. Tony
But
Romo.
sports is like one of the only avenues where
right.
you physically playing the sport makes you qualified to now take part in all these other avenues of the sport. It's literally the only thing I can think of, right? Because even if you talk about like small business owners, like leaving it to their son, I guarantee you that that son probably worked there for about 10, 15 years, right? He watched how dad had to flip the pizzas and like he's there, like they're seeing it. Sports is the only thing out there where you find people that just because they physically excelled in the sport are automatically qualified to do all these different things in the sport with no experience or training whatsoever.
It's absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. And we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
As your wisdom, I'm gonna you're like the what's the person that people used to the Oz. That's what I was saying. The Wizard of Oz. Yes, the Great Oz.
Just dropping a bomb there at the end of the.
That's it. I'm gonna call you
Hopefully,
the
people will listen past our political rants to get to the good stuff at the end, which was this, right? Like,
I thought all of it was pretty
maybe there'll
good.
be an investor listening that says, "You know what? You guys are right. Let's do it." You never know, man.
That's why they have shorts. When I break them up,
yep.
The people who like the political stuff will watch that.
Yeah.
And the people who like the sports part, like that's the. By the way, that's the beauty of the podcast.
Yeah.
We could talk about something at the front end that no one wants to hear about, but they like hearing us. And when the shorts come out, they're like, "Oh, they did talk about sports today."
Yeah. I love it. All right, man.
All right, Marie, I'll let you go.
All right. See you.
Have a great practice. I'll see you next Friday.
Thanks. Sounds good. Bye.
All right. Bye.